In this lesson, we're going to discuss antitrust policy, which is another example of government intervention in the economy to try to make markets more efficient than might otherwise occur. Antitrust policy addresses in particular the problems associated with a monopoly or oligopoly, even monopolistic competition where firms have market power and therefore may have the price too high or the quantity too low compared to what would be efficient. Antitrust policy is different from economic regulation where the government tries to regulate an existing firm. In the case of antitrust policy, there's some more intense adjustments that are required. The purpose of the antitrust laws is pretty simple. It's to keep firms with too much monopoly power from forming in the first place, or even to break up such firms, break them apart when they exist. The idea is to prevent collusion between firms and to make sure that there's not a price fixing and other things that allow firms to actually act like monopolies. So again, there's kind of two purposes. One is to keep firms from getting too big with too much monopoly power. That can either be done by preventing them from forming or breaking them apart. And the second is to prevent collusion between the firms once they're already existing. So let's see how this works in terms of the law in the United States. We have a major antitrust law called the Sherman Antitrust Act from way back in 1890. It has two important sections that are relevant to antitrust policy. One is law against price fixing, and that occurs when one or two or three firms get together and try to get together and keep the price high. They're trying to avoid the competition. An example of that is what has been alleged in the case of Apple providing ebook sales on the iPad. When it came in, there was a period where a number of publishers seemed to raise their prices almost together, and that made the U.S. Justice Department suspicious that there was some kind of collusion or price fixing going on. So they've taken action, and most recently they've won the case in court that there seems to have been some price fixing action. Of course, Apple and the book publishers will think differently about that, and there's likely to be a challenge. But that's a classic case, very recent case, where the government has taken on a price fixing action. Section 2 of the Sherman Act looks directly at attempts to monopolize. The word is technically called attempt to monopolize. And these are serious. When these are found, it's actually considered a felony. The Sherman Act tries to deal with this by actually breaking up firms, and over its long history, it has broken up firms. 33 is a pretty good estimate, and a lot of those were the oil firms in the early part of the 20th century. But there's more recent examples of breaking up of AT&T, and there was actually an attempt to break apart IBM, but it basically didn't work. They weren't able to get the case together and make it stand in court, and so IBM was not broken apart. In fact, the idea of breaking apart firms has become less and less a way that the Sherman Act actually operates. Section 2 is much less common than Section 1, largely because you can imagine how difficult it is to break up existing firms. It's quite likely some more damage would be created than actually the remedy that one has sought. So that's the Sherman Act, and you can see, again, this is a focus on monopoly power of firms either getting together through price fixing or simply being too big in the first place. The other kind of antitrust policy focuses on mergers of firms or potential mergers. That comes from the Clayton Act back in 1914, not quite as old as the Sherman Act. The Clayton Act established the Federal Trade Commission, and it also made sure the Department of Justice had a focus on antitrust. The Antitrust Division of the U.S. Department of Justice was formed. And the purpose of this act and the government agencies that were set up to enforce it was to prevent mergers where there seemed to be too much market power or too much monopoly power caused by the merger. That's the basic idea there. You look at a couple of firms. One firm might be considering of acquiring another or taking over another, just merging together. And if the new firm is such a large part of the market, perhaps, that has market power, has the ability to set prices, bring prices higher than what would be competitive or near competitive, then the government is supposed to take action according to the Clayton Act. Of course, they're working on the basic supply and demand model, which you can see in this picture, demand sloping downward, marginal revenue below the demand, as we've seen before, marginal cost upward sloping. And a competitive firm would have a price labeled PC there, the monopolist have a price right above that, and in addition, the quantity produced by the monopolist, QM, would be less than what produced by the competitive firm. So behind the scenes in all these cases, whether a merger is going to take place or not, is that kind of model. And the idea is to try to take some action so that prices will be closer to the competitive price and the quantity produced in the market by the firms closer to the competitive quantity. Now, how does the judgment made by the government about whether a merger will result in too much market power? How do they decide whether the merger is going to lead to too high a price and too low a quantity? Well, one thing they look at is really just a measure of the market power. In some sense, that's just how steep that demand curve is. Remember, we've thought about this idea of the price-cost margin. It's basically the extent to which the price is the price is higher than the marginal cost. If the price is higher than marginal cost, and the price-cost margin is higher, and the larger that price-cost margin, the more the damage of the monopoly could be, the greater the reason to intervene. In this picture, you can see the price-cost margin really is just the extent to which the intersection of the red line at the monopolist quantity is higher than the intersection of the blue line. So that gap there is the price-cost margin. And what the Justice Department and the FTC tries to do is estimate the size of that price-cost margin without a merger and with a merger. And if it gets much larger with the merger, then they'll try to drop it. Another important consideration in deciding whether to intervene is how easy it is to have other firms come in to the industry. So for example, if you maybe have 4 firms in an industry, 2 of them merged, so there's only 3, you might say, oh, just only 3, that's not much competition. But if it's easy for a 5th firm or another firm to come into the industry, then really puts competitive pressures on it. So you can even have an industry with just a few firms, but if it's easy to come in, that pressure, that competition pressure, firms come in and join it, will keep prices closer to the competitive equilibrium. So they have to consider this ease of entry as well. Now, it's very important in any kind of regulation or intervention by the government like this one to make sure it's as understandable and predictable as possible. It's very important for firms to kind of know what the rules of the game are. If they're considering spending a lot of money to merge or acquire another firm, they ought to know to what extent the government is likely to intervene, basically set the rules of the game. Very important to get that certainty. So what has happened over the years is the government has tried to be more definitive about how it measures these market power, price-cost margin, ease of entry, and they've introduced some quantitative measures to do that. The most common one is worth taking a few minutes to study, and that's an index called the Herfindahl-Hirschman Index, HHI for short. Sometimes people in the business just call it the HERF. And what it does, it tries to measure the concentration in a market to the extent to which only a few firms have a lot of market share. By definition, it's simply summing the squares of the market shares of all the firms in the industry. So for example, if there were 3 firms in the industry and one firm had a share of 30%, another firm had a share of 30%, and the third firm had a share of 40%, then you'd square 30, add it to square 30 again, and add finally 40 squared, and you'd get a sum of 3,400, as you can see in this little example. The higher is the HHI, the more concentrated the industry is. And by squaring these shares, you got a measure that increases quite a bit as a square as that shares rise in numbers. So it's a penalty, if you like, that tries to measure in a way that's meaningful the degree of concentration. So how does the Justice Department or the FTC use this measure to decide on a merger? Well, they actually have kind of a formula, and the formula works as in this example. They will challenge a merger if the HHI in the industry is already above 1,800, and the merger would increase the HHI by 50 or more points. So it has to be reasonably concentrated already, HHI above 1,800, and the concentration has to increase by a certain amount in the merger before they'll challenge it. So for example, in this three-firm industry, if the two smaller share firms merge so that you now have two firms, one with 60% and the other with 40%, and you calculate the HHI by squaring those two shares, you get a sum which is 5,200. So it's not only above 1,800 at the beginning, the change is way more than 50. Change is way more than 50 as they move to only having two firms. The HHI rose, in this case, from 3,400 to 5,200, so much more, if you like, than the 50 in the threshold. The best way, I think, to understand how this works in practice is to consider some real examples. And so what I would like to do now is share with you a very recent example in the United States where this has been applied. It's an interesting one for many ways. It has to do with the merger of two beer manufacturers. And one of those Anheuser-Busch InBev, and the other is Grupo Modelo. Anheuser-Busch InBev, as you can gather, already represented a merger of two beer manufacturing firms, Anheuser-Busch and InBev, but now that's one firm. Grupo Modelo is a firm in Mexico. Anheuser-Busch InBev produces beers like Budweiser. Grupo Modelo produces beers like Corona. And so they wanted to merge. In particular, Anheuser-Busch InBev wanted to merge with Grupo Modelo for many reasons. One reason is it wanted to have a larger presence in Latin America, where Grupo Modelo produced a lot and sold a lot of beer. So by merging together, Anheuser-Busch InBev realized that they could have a more global presence and of course, seek to earn higher profits as a result. But what actually occurs as a result of this merger is a much larger concentration within the United States, and that was the concern that the U.S. government would have about such a merger. So let's consider how the HHI would apply in this case. This is just a press release, so you can study it at your leisure, that was put out in January of 2013, announcing that the Justice Department was going to file this lawsuit challenging this merger between these two firms. It summarizes how the firms produce different kinds of beer, what the popular beer is in the United States produced by Anheuser-Busch InBev, that happens to be Bud Light. The most popular export into the United States is Corona from Grupo Modelo. So these are large players in the market. And so now, given this suit, you have to think about what's going on. Was this the right thing to do in terms of an objection or a challenge? Well, let's look at the HHI and see what that does is apply this model or this theory, analyze the merger between these two firms. So first of all, I have a measure here in the table of market shares for really the top four firms in the industry. Market share of Anheuser-Busch InBev is 39. Market share of Miller Coors, 29. Market share of Grupo Modelo, 7. Market share of Heineken USA, 6. And those are the shares of production of beer in the United States that the Justice Department was focusing on. If you square those numbers, as it's shown in the right, you get the numbers that would go into the HHI index. 1,521 is the number for Anheuser-Busch InBev when you square it 39. Now the question is, should the merger be allowed according to the rule, if you like, the rule of thumb that we just discussed, and which is a consideration for the merger? Well, first of all, obviously the HHI is greater than 1,800. You don't even have to look at the other firms in the industry. And by the way, there are other firms. We just listed the top four because that's what we need to do. There's other firms with a smaller share, many firms actually with even smaller shares. But if you just consider this top four, you can already see that it's greater than 1,800. Just the top two are greater than 1,800. So now the question is, will the merger increase the HHI by more than 50? And you can calculate that pretty quickly by taking the 39 and the 7 squared. That becomes 1,521 plus 49, or 1,570. So that's the contribution of Anheuser-Busch InBev and Grupo Modelo to the HHI without a merger. If they merge together, then 39 plus 7 will equal 46. And if you square that, you get 2,116. That would be the addition to the HHI of those two firms had they been merged. Obviously, the difference between 2116 and 1570 is greater than 50. It's actually 546. So according to this idea, to this procedure, the challenge makes sense. The challenge makes sense. And in this case, what has actually happened? And I think it's very interesting to see how this was resolved. Again, there was a suit challenging the merger itself, but in terms of negotiations, the private companies and the government realized that there was a way to deal with this problem. And so what they decided to do was to have the U.S. sales of Grupo Modelo's business, largely Corona in the U.S., be sold, that business sold to another firm, that firm not even in the beer business before, so it wasn't something you'd add to get a larger market share, it would be a market share by itself, was not already in the beer business. And so that business that Modelo would be selling to this other firm would have a market share of about 7%. So the merger itself was allowed to continue, and that enabled Anheuser-Busch InBev to extend its presence in Latin America and other parts of the world through Grupo Modelo, but at the same time kept the market shares in the United States where they were before the merger. And after this was done, the Justice Department allowed it to go through. And then the final press release, which I'll just share with you, is the Justice Department indicating that it's reached a settlement about this. Anheuser-Busch InBev and Grupo Modelo in this beer case, they've agreed to keep the market shares the same as they were because you actually have another firm coming into the business. In some sense, everybody's reasonably happy here. And as the Justice Department indicates in this memo press release, the happiest of all probably should be beer drinkers whose prices will remain lower than they otherwise would. So in sum, this is an example of how antitrust policy works in practice in the United States. It's an important example that occurs currently, and it fits directly into the methodology of trying to keep market power low, keep concentration at reasonable levels using the HHI index. Thank you.